Ahead and get started with our keynote address. I'm incredibly excited to have Lae'l here to speak about the work that she is doing, and just in general, she's an amazing person and somebody who, in this profession, I look up to a lot, and I aspire to be as amazing as she is one day in the work that she is doing to document not just activism, but Black and African American people in general. So I'll go ahead and let Lae'l introduce herself. But thank you, Lae'l, all the way from the East Coast, coming to Arizona to speak today. So thank you.
Too kind. I am also inspired by you and hope to be able to be a reflection of you as well. Um, my name is Lae'l Hughes-Watkins. I'm the Associate Director of Engagement, Inclusion, and Reparative Archiving at the University of Maryland. And yes, that is a title that does not exist anywhere, anywhere else. I had the opportunity to actually create that position and was humbled that I had the opportunity to do so and create that kind of space at the University of Maryland. I'm also the founder of Project Stand, a national consortium of colleges, universities around the country dedicated to the ethical documentation of student activism, with a particular focus in marginalized communities. Um, so I want to begin this conversation by dedicating my talk today to Saba Shabaka. If you're listening, you're out there. Saba is a UMD alum who, when I initially arrived at the University of Maryland, she was one of the first students, one of the first faces that gave me the lay of the land, told me what was going on with student organizing. She is also someone who, despite all of her massive accomplishments at the university with respect to solidarity building, is always unsure of what legacy she has left behind or how much impact she has made. She is the founder of Black Turps Matter at the University of Maryland. She also gave us material for our Rising Up exhibition that we had last year in October of 2023 to highlight the summer of 2020. So I want to dedicate my talk to Saba and all the organizers here that may be in the room who might be listening, and those we will run across this work generations from now. So I want to play this video of Saba, who was in the middle of an occupation action in front of the Department of Education 2 years ago. And we just did a guerrilla style. I had my questions all prepared. I'm like, oh, we're going to do this podcast. And when the video turned on, she was in front of the Department of Education, like in it. And so we just went with it. So if you can play the next one. So I hope that Sava and DeAndre are able to look at this record. This is a part of our Project Stand Blueprint podcast. This is one of our earlier attempts at excuse me, at doing a podcast. And I found their conversation so interesting because they were literally in real time telling us how they were navigating, how important feedback was for them to make sure they were following a path that was best for the entire community. And I felt that conversation was so powerful to capture between them. And so I feel I really feel like this was an example of how thankful I am for the work I get to do. and the interactions I get to have with our student organizers. And the fact that she kept saying, that Sava kept saying that this is for future generations. And I feel like that speaks so much to why we are in part here today. Um, so on this day, we have gathered for the Black Collection Symposium at Arizona State University on the legacy and future of Black student activism. Let us gather today in the midst of campaigns, legislation, policies, rhetoric, and sometimes even acts of violence working to suppress and silence our imaginations and our ongoing march toward liberation. While those who work feverishly to create chaos, pedagogies, and algorithms to protect the system that says, you can't talk about Martin. And if you talk about Martin, then you damn sure can't talk about Ella. And if you can't talk about Ella, you ain't going to mention Malcolm. And then you better erase the words and ban the books that speak of the Haitian Revolution or the Little Rock Nine. And you better not visit the archives about radical love spoken by Audrey or the revolution of Fred. Don't speak of Wilson C. Riles, who worked to desegregate Flagstaff schools. We better not talk of the shades of Route 66 and the stories of Green Book that afforded so many Black travelers to find sanctuary on the Mother Road and move past sundown towns to make it from the east to the west, winding from Chicago to LA, that's the best, as Nat King Cole sung. Because there are individuals who are creating communities and those communities are running systems to silence us. Then, might I say, our presence, our very presence here today in this room is an act of defiance because we will not be turned around. Ruha Benjamin is a sociologist and a professor in the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University. Her primary focus is the relationship between innovation and equity, particularly the intersection of race, justice, and technology. She recently published Imagination, a manifesto in which she discusses radical imagination. I ask you today, let us do just that. As we think of students' roles over time, think of Black organizing, and hear of inspiration and challenges like the panel we just heard, the work of the memory keeper or the archivist, the soul of the archive, allows our stories to provide possible futures. The exclusion of our stories in the archive is one of the pathways to help destroy our imaginations. And what is liberation if you can't dream of it as you build it? Benjamin says we must learn to protect our imagination. But how did I get here? How did I decide to help be of service and be of the keepers of history of Black student social movements with so many others? So in full transparency, I was in my early 20s, y'all, when I learned about archives land. After a failed attempt to work at the local neighborhood paper after graduating with my journalism and poli-sci degree, designing kids' pages and fluff content, while I waited to hear if I passed the aptitude test that would allow me to work at the news desk, it became a dream deferred. While the paper had my test scores for more than a month, which they sat on, by the time they finally told me I did pass, we were in failed negotiations and a strike was now upon us. I was one of the few Black folks on my floor who worked on the paper. The other young Black woman that I saw with some regularity, I also graduated with her and she worked the obits. I told her I wasn't crossing any picket lines. My family was union, and so peace out. I later found out that they were shuttling staff in blacked out vans and even had cots in the newsroom for overnighters. Distraught but determined, I decided to apply for an MA in English at a small local school, Youngstown State University. Please don't judge me, because if you decide to Google this school, it was a different place when I attended. They now have some MAGA person that's the president. Um, there are still amazing people there, but the politics that have taken over the campus have made it a place that I no longer recognize. That was my public service announcement. However, I decided to do my thesis on the history of the Black press after much back and forth with my thesis advisor, who said that's too broad, narrow it down. I came across a small write-up by Darlene Clark Hines about Fayem Jackson, the first African-American female correspondent for the Associated Negro Press. They was dope, y'all. She was covering the Harlem Renaissance of the West Coast, launched her own publication called Flash in her late 20s, and did interviews with Haile Selassie. As I continued to search the web for additional resources to glean more insight into who Faye was and what legacy she left behind, I learned some of the correspondence, articles, photographs, and ephemera were accessible in these places called special collections and archives. I saw material at the University of Southern California, the University of California, Los Angeles, and the Huntington Library. I foolishly thought I could request all the historical documents to be sent to me in the mail in the comfort of my apartment, and perhaps even email. But alas, I was kindly informed that only so much could be photocopied, the rest would have to be viewed in person. I scoffed. I laughed. Don't you know I'm a broke grad student? But with enthusiasm of my partner, who is with me here today, we said F these bills, including our rent, and bought 2 round trip tickets to Los Angeles. It's so funny because every time when I think about this story, and I've shared it different times over the years, and now that I'm at an institution and I get similar emails thinking that, oh, you can just send me all these records. And then I'm like, that's me. That was when I arrived at USC, my first introductory stop to a physical place in archives land. I recall showing up for my scheduled visit, having to provide my ID, and thinking, it's that serious. I remember putting up my belongings in a little cubby and sitting at this long wooden table with other researchers who were methodically looking through folders, delicately turning one sheet at a time, some wearing the classic white glove. As I continued to survey the room, another Black woman caught my eye. She smiled and nodded. I was like, okay, we in here. As I sat down, another young Black woman came from behind a curtain, rolling this rickety wooden cart with 2 boxes just for me. I was like, 3 of us in a predominantly white space. Existence is resistance. So my body, our 3 bodies, the counter narrative to who gets to be in this space, I actually began to feel at ease. I took out my Nikon camera that I borrowed from my parents and looked at how others handled the records, hoping to mimic and appear as if I had been there before. I finally drew out my first folder and found the initial document referencing Faye. I continued to learn about her life in these small glimmers of light, that she was one of the founding 6 members that started the Upsilon Delta Sigma Theta chapter at USC, and that Jackson toiled as a cub reporter for the California Eagle, contributor for a Black Los Angeles newspaper, and Pacific Defender, which allowed her the opportunity to report on the racial disparities at USC while imparting a message of justice and equality. If USC was this white in the early 2000s, based on just my anecdotal experience as a researcher on campus, I can only imagine what she faced in the 1920s. And yet there it was and is. As I struggled to find myself after leaving at the beginning of a labor strike at my local paper, here was Faye, generations before I was born, at a predominantly white space where her existence was an example of Black world making. With her Delta sorors and activist journalism, she imagined a world and created a space to exist. Might I dare do the same? In Early Black World Making, Body, Compass, and Text by Judith Madeira, she writes, Framing the work of Black activist narratives as world-making production helps us better understand the organizational energies that go into building communities inside racist polities. Madeira goes on to say that world making suggests the modal possibility for a vibrant Black life. Visiting USC, UCLA, and Huntington Library, I felt a thread, one tugging at me, a sense of interconnectivity and familiarity. In the same way, I looked at my paternal grandmother's albums with life on our family farm during Oberlin summers, Black people with land and lots of it, smiling and playing horseshoes intermingled with echoes of my father's stories, working hot summers with his cousins to help maintain it, as his great aunt, Big Annie, tall as an oak tree if you were a child, as she looked far over the land to make sure the children stayed out of trouble. My maternal grandmother's album, partially filled with the Detroit of who's who, local politicians, as she held court and played hostess in her home while my mom moved in and out of frame, a time before she would even think of me. My elders were the memory keepers of the family, utilizing their praxis of documentation and preservation, their ways of knowing, their classifications and metadata, recording their quotidian practices of activism. A shout out to Michaela Jones if she's listening, a UMD alum reminding me that deep and broad ways we serve in a movement through the everyday. Caring for myself is not self-indulgence. It is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. Audre Lorde, 1988. So I continue to grapple with the familiarity of my growing comprehension of memory work. Before I could put a word to the concept, before I knew of the writings of Arturo Schomburg, whose work precedes so much of the current discourse around the call to dismantle the colonial archival praxis, I proceeded to shift through the faded images of Faye's travels overseas. I proceeded to shift through the, no, it's okay. The faded, it's okay. There we go. Who's gonna get it? Covering international affairs of the Black diaspora, her legacy, her life expanding outside any prescribed Black taxonomy, moving beyond the simplified classifications of our existence. Although Faye was a ghost, a specter of the past, she gave me a doorway to possible futures. Black collections are material evidence of not only traumatizing histories of human subjugation, the backlash of Reconstruction, and Billie Holiday's strange fruit body swinging, but they are also a framing of freedom, liberation, future worlds. Might we engage in collective imagining, as Benjamin writes, when we imagine different worlds together, writing shared stories and plotting futures in which we can all flourish, in which we can all flourish. After receiving my MA in English, I decided to get my MLIS paper and pursue a life that would allow me to help others who wanted to imagine, to be seen and be found the same way I did. So my labor in this area officially began at Kent State University, where I did work around the Black campus movement. As the first African-American university archivist at Kent State, I was honored and humbled to bring in the Lafayette Tolliver collection. Tolliver was an alumnus who granted me and the university the opportunity to provide access to the most radical visual historiography of Black life at Kent during the 1960s and 70s. This collection would help serve as a catalyst into my investigation into the Black campus movement, the academic arm of the Black Power movement, and how it evolved at the university. In a piece I wrote, Between Two Worlds, a look at the impact of the Black campus movement on the anti-war era of 1968 to 1970 at Kent, I detailed how the university was just one of thousands of colleges and universities that had to respond to dual challenges, the demands of a Black demographic who felt their civil rights were under siege and the frustrations of a predominantly white anti-war movement. And not that Black students were not being drafted for this war, still they were fighting a separate war on the other end of the spectrum, demanding an increase in Black student admissions, Black faculty, the creation of Black studies, cultural spaces, and programming that reflected a student body whose identity was also a part of the Black diaspora. The Tolliver Collection gave me a gateway into the Black names and faces who were part of the campus, and at that time also left a legacy of existing that was often eclipsed and missing in the archival record, buried under administrative records that instead told the stories of policing of Black bodies, where the troublemakers lived, what kind of household did they come from. The Tolliver Collection increased the visibility of another narrative, one that also showed community, despite representing only approximately 3% of the campus. They created and amassed lives that the white rage of the Vietnam War and existing on a predominantly white campus and community could not pierce nor destroy. The Tolliver Collection has been fully digitized, and I'm sorry I don't have pictures with me today, but it is available online. The Tolliver Collection has been fully digitized and also highlighted by the Black Archives Company, founded in 2015 by Renata Charlize. They have highlighted this collection on their Instagram account on multiple occasions with more than 20,000 likes. And the responses, while the Made for narrative, which is what Kent State is mostly known for with respect to several students who were killed during anti-war protests in 1970, it was the feed and the comments on the beauty of Blackness, on the beauty of the Black bodies, the countering of white narrative that were so powerful in the Instagram post. One poster wrote, "You all have been posting many pictures from my alma mater, Kent State, as of late, and it brings me such joy. Attending this PWI had its challenges, but these pictures remind me of the beauty and significance of community on campus throughout the years. Please keep them coming, as many of us weren't exposed to these historical photos as students." In an interview with Vox on February 22nd of last year, Charlize stated, "I think about Black futures as taking the work forward and Black archives as a simple vehicle for connecting Black memory and imaginations by bringing a spotlight to the Black experience. We need to make a record so that future generations who may not yet be born can see how we took up space when we were here, how we engaged, how we were in fellowship with one another, what our voice sounded like, even how we laughed." Before I left Kent State, I had the opportunity to bring Black alumni from this era, from the 60s and 70s. Most hadn't seen each other since they graduated. They all gathered for the Lafayette Tolliver exhibition that I had to promise to put together before he allowed me the acquisition. I wept. The work we do here, the work you do here, it's a beacon. It was folks there at this exhibition, and we had a program. We were supposed to come and say opening remarks, and then you go to the exhibit and you had a delicious meal. But we were running behind because there was so much crying and hugging, and I haven't seen you. It was like a family reunion. And so to be in that space at Kent State and know that I had a role in bringing all these folks together was one of the most, still to this day, one of the most powerful moments of my career. Excuse me. And if you click on the so, but also at Kent State, I was able to launch Project Stand, which officially launched in 2017. Project Stand is a consortium, as I mentioned earlier, of approximately now 80 colleges and universities, independent scholars, student activists who all believe in the importance, again, of the ethical documentation of student activism, again, with a particular focus in marginalized communities. And so it's been humbling to be able to be a part of and help lead an initiative where we have been having such thoughtful, engaging conversations over the last 6 years. Over the last 6 years, it started with just a few institutions in Ohio. Oberlin, Ohio State University. Ohio State University actually was the first college that I reached out to when I was thinking about how we needed to create a space online, bringing all of the collections or creating an access point for collections pertaining to student activism. At that time, this was happening in the aftermath of the Black Lives Matter movement. We were seeing die-ins on our campus because of the Ferguson uprising. So much organizing was happening online, um, on social media platforms at the time, Twitter, now known as X. Um, and so being at Kent State and doing the work about the Black campus movement and seeing that there were already gaps in the historical record with respect to the 60s and 70s, I was like, oh no, what are we going to do now? We were barely doing a good job capturing that history. What are we going to do now that students are organizing in digital spaces? So being able help help lead this conversation where we were trying to figure out how we were going to do that work, past and present, was really a meaningful period in my life, especially when you're trying to find others who see and value the work in the same way that you do. And if you don't have those people in your space, the work can feel lonely sometimes. So I feel like Project Stand kind of saved me to keep me from leaving the field because then I found other people who believed in the work and had already been having these conversations long before before I hit the scene. Um, so as I continue to be honest, as I continue to think about the future of Black organizing, Project Stand, we're not only just focusing on creating this digital space for this access to these records, which have historically been hidden in our stacks and haven't been easily discovered because they weren't a priority. Now that we have Project Stand, a lot of us that were coming together have been using this project to say, hey, let's make processing and digitizing this collection that talks about when Stokely Carmichael came to campus or when members of SNCC visited campus or the development of the Black Student Union or various solidarity building actions. um, we have been able to use Project Stand to say, look at this community that believes in this work. We as our institutions need to put equity into this work and support making these collections discoverable. So in addition to doing that, now we've been able to do residencies, workshops, and so that has allowed us to interact with student activists in even more meaningful ways. Because as much as we're providing these resources like archiving student activism toolkits, which tells them how they can um, be the leaders of their own stories and the leaders of their own documentation, but also have conversations about how are they um, creating safe spaces within their own spaces, and making sure that they're having those conversations with one another, um, making sure that if materials come to your institution, make sure your community is okay with that. So we've been able to have such thoughtful conversations on the website. This past year, we worked with some amazing fellows to create a zine, which we asked those fellows and they were it was at AUC Robert Woodruff Library, and we asked those fellows to create a zine to reimagine what it looks like to archive a student movement. Because so many times, as I know so many of you in this room know and understand, we do focus on the trauma. but there's also joy in social movements. There's also friendships and camaraderie that's being made in social movements. So what does it look like to archive all of that? What does it look like to archive the full human, the full existence of an activist? And so in the zine, we asked our fellows to do that work, and we've gotten so much good and positive responses, not just from student activists, but also from other archivists that's starting to rethink how they do their work in their spaces and what different type of records they should consider archiving in doing that work. Um, So now, I'm the Associate Director of Inclusion and Reparative Archiving at UMD, and I've had immense opportunity to continue the labor that I started at Kent State University, the work of Black world making through a Black Experience project, along with this amazing scholar, Dr. Francina Turner, who I had the opportunity to work with, who was a postdoc fellow, because of a CLEAR grant. And we were able to really, under her leadership, uh, established 60 oral histories for our Black Experience project. And if you could, on the next slide, a little clip from that project. I'm sorry, back to the slide. So where I was going, I saw see, like, but it was so nice when you saw a Black person. Yeah, they were very friendly. Uh, so, but it wasn't okay. I could feel a possibility. That was underneath at first. Um, but you know, when I graduated, all of my friends who have to be Jewish were going to the University of Maryland. All of my friends who have to be Black, so they were going to Florida State College, historical Black college. And I went to the University of Maryland. I thought it would be cool, even my Jewish friends, only to get there and find out after the first couple of weeks what they would have trying to do rush, which I attended some of their celebrations. And everyone looked at me as though I was out of place. I was usually the only Black. And that's when I got to get abandoned by my Jewish friends. Well, when I got to college, it's kind of like I was a first time brother. But then now it's at the University of all staff have not got on, and yet all time not on complex. Now, had not it's a time of integration, and I found that was about segregated, still segregated, because that roughly by church, by they didn't know what this.
that we got it going. For another evidence. I guess at the time I would have got voluntold that we were sitting now. Like I said, for 3 years. But was on our own or academic, but proper standards are. So soon after we started pushing out some of those issues, that's when we definitely person. I do have
So that was just a snippet. It's a part of our reparative histories project at the University of Maryland, and again, we've been able to interview nearly 60 individuals. Um, we thought it was really important to have intergenerational interviews. Obviously, you heard very complicated experiences that the students had. We also do have some stories where uh Black alumni have expressed the joy of the various concerts that have come to campus over time, and especially in the 90s, that was like the R&B era. So there's a lot of conversations about the amazing artists that came in the 90s. But it is a very rich project because it really provides you a tapestry of what the Black experience has been at the University of Maryland. And one of the things that has been really eye-opening to me, and being able to do that work in concert again with Dr. Francina Turner, um, is that they have been so happy to hear from us that we did that outreach. I'm sure the amazing panel that was up here earlier, speaking of South Phoenix, that so often our stories are not told. And then sometimes there have been situations where I've had to even beg because they didn't think their stories were of value to be told. And so then to get that yes, and for them to become vulnerable with you, and you see their guard come down because now they trust you. And you gotta do the work, you have to do the research, because if you come into the space and you have no idea of the context of the environment that was happening at the particular period that they were in. It takes a little more time to build that those bonds, but the joy of saying, "Wow, somebody cares." Like we have really heard some of the people that we've interviewed say, "Wow, somebody cares," and now the students can hear our stories and what we've been through. To be able to provide that kind of meaning, with someone, with a Black alumni member, again, that has been this work is not easy, but that is what when that is poured into me, that is what helps me keep to do the work. Um, and you saw the various ages of the folks in that particular clip, and so you definitely had individuals who would have been alive and been around during, um all of the legislation that would have been passed to desegregate the campus. Um, and so the University of Maryland being a place in 1935 with the Donald Gaines Murray case. I don't know if anybody's heard that of that case, but that was an attempt for that student, Donald Gaines Murray, to desegregate the School of Law at the University of Maryland. And it helped lay the groundwork for the Brown v. Board education case, that would later play out. I'm also part of the 1856 project at the University of Maryland, which is University Studying Slavery. And last summer, as part of our Summer Research Institute, we visited statues in Annapolis that paid tribute to Murray. that paid tribute to Thurgood Marshall. And on our ride home, on our ride back to campus, one of the students was like, "Oh no, we learned that they basically dismantled affirmative action." And so to know, to be leaving that space and to get that news, and then for me to think about the alumni who would have seen that whole cycle happen that we've interviewed, see it come into place, be the fruits, be able to experience the fruits of that legislation, to have been some of the students to break the racial barrier at our campus, and to now also be alive to see that diminish was such, again, another moment where I could see those through lines and all the work that I and so many others have been doing. And so when we talk about today about the future of student activism, I have to say that definitely when we were on that ride back, all of our hearts broke. It was the students, it was our fellows, it was myself, it was the head of special collection and archives. Um, and as we now see the new data come in with seeing that marginalized identities are declining at institutions, um, again, I am reminded that the future of Black student organizing is ongoing. It comes in waves. It is a river that eventually moves lands and changes landscapes. And yes, the winds we all know come at a glacial pace. Um, but the thing that I kept asking all of us today to think about our collective imagining of possible worlds and liberation, the calling of our ancestors, our cartographers who provide us the blueprints that exist in the archives, the joy between those spaces, um, the community that is in this room. Uh, I hope that the legacy we think about is one of hope, because I believe that is really what will sustain us as we move forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Lael. Really appreciate you and your perspective on a lot of this, because it really informs and grounds a lot of the work that I continue to do. And so I'm always very appreciative of you and of your ability to speak truth to a lot of things that I think a lot of us feel, but then also at the same time know is happening, and why this work that we do to document Black and African American people everywhere is critical and important. And we need everybody in this fight. And so thank you. Do we have any questions for Lael? I see a hand. Sorry, the column might obscure my vision, but I see a hand. I see a hand.
Thank you so much. I'm curious to hear more about how the Black Alumni Project in particular is landing in the contemporary moment at your institution. You told us a little bit about some of the students' experience of that sort of richness with the getting rid of affirmative action.
Mm.
I would imagine, and maybe I'm wrong, that maybe you're doing this pocket of really important work over here while other parts of the institution are kind of moving in the opposite direction. But can you tell us anything about how you're thinking about or seeing any kind of impact of the Black alumni stories in the kind of space, and how the leadership is sort of talking about your project?
Thank you so much for that question. To be honest, I actually feel rather fortunate. At the University of Maryland, the image I showed at the beginning, our Rising Up exhibition, we included some of those oral histories from our Black Experience project that's under our larger reparative histories effort. And we covered some very difficult history in that exhibition. And shout out to the UA team at the University of Maryland. While I'm thankful for being a lead curator, our university archivists, our student assistants and our GA and students that we had years before. It took us forever to do that exhibit. But anyway, we talked about a fire that was at the Eastern Shore campus, which is where they sent all the Black students because they didn't want them at the main campus in College Park. That led to the death of several folks, even some children, because it was like a work program that they had at the Eastern Shore campus, and there were mothers that were working there who had their children on site. And because of the poor funding of the Eastern Shore campus, some of the buildings were made with materials that should no longer have been used. And so there was a fire that ended up killing some little ones, and there were women jumping out of buildings that hurt. It's a horrible story, and you've never heard of it before. There was a fire at the main campus in 1912 that a lot of people are aware of at campus, but the fire at Eastern Shore in the 40s, that was not a very familiar story. So I say that to say that as students and folks have walked into that space last year, they were in shock that we were able to talk about these histories. And so I do feel our oral history project generally has been well received by administration. We could always use more support in doing that work. But like it's been referenced and discussed by administration. And so I don't think it's not a point of shame, but more of a story of pride. So I'm thankful that it has been well received. In respect to the current moment, we're actually in the process of revisiting like our questions so that we can be more inclusive of what is happening on a broader and national landscape right now. So I would have to get back to you about how what has happened with respect to affirmative action, and even our current political landscape has impacted and how our alumni and our current students are feeling. Because like I said, we are revisiting our lines of questions and trying to customize them more to the moment that we're in right now. I hope that it was like a ooh.
Yes, I was going to ask if there's any online questions. I see a couple. I will have our moderators who are. Okay, Corey Johnson, if you could unmute, please, online, and you could ask your question. Corey, please let us know if you are speaking. Corey Johnson, can you hear us? If you are having difficulties, please type in the chat if you are having an issue. We'll come back to Corey once we figure out the situation. It looks like there are a couple of other online questions as well.
Of this, will there be a recording available?
Yes, we are recording this via Zoom. And so once we are able to download and do some of our work to make sure the transcripts are good, we will be sharing these recordings out to folks in order for them to have access to them. We'll do one more time for Corey Johnson. If not, we will move on. Okay. Do we have any more in room questions for Lae'l? Oh, Tracy, another one? Excellent.
Thank you again. Could you tell us a little bit more about the Project Stand consortium and how it's funded and governed and just kind of growing over time?
No, thank you for that question. So we do have an advisory board. Do we need to do a better job about rotating people off? Because what's taking longer? It's like, thank you for being on the advisory board. But we do have an advisory board. And then with respect to and the advisory board leads like what are we going to focus on in a particular year. They are important and integral to like right now we're working on a Mellon grant and focusing on what are the areas we want to focus on with respect to that Mellon grant. A lot of it this time around is going to be about sustainability. So we've been funded by, we've had an IMLS grant. Um, we just wrapped up a $750,000 Mellon grant. And then right now we're applying for another Mellon grant. And so, and if we're lucky, hopefully we'll be able to start that next year. One of the things that I think we all feel fortunate with respect to Project Stand is that a lot of people just give their support in kind. Like, yes, we exist to some degree on soft money, but like because people believe in the work. Right now we have an amazing person named Francis Wu, um, who's not a student, but we met them when they were at the university when we were at the University of Chicago for a symposium, and they were just excited about the work. And they were from the University of California, UCSD, if I remember correctly. Sorry, Francis, if I got that wrong. And so Francis has just been excited about the work and has been working tirelessly with other members of our consortium to do a demands project where we want to highlight the history of demands at our member institutions, starting in the 60s. And so it's going to take us a long time to get this project done. But Francis, if it wasn't for Francis, we wouldn't be anywhere. Like Francis has been keeping the demands committee like on point and have been doing surveys and all these other kind of tools to help us gather data. And so we have a web digital initiatives team, and they help keep the website going. And again, not always getting paid, and just a member from George Mason, Oberlin, Wright State, like that has just been so amazing in helping us keep the website and working on a database that we're trying to launch as well. So a lot of it is just belief and support in the work. So just really feel fortunate about that, but doing our best to get people paid when we could get a grant. So, but thank you for that question.
Any other questions for Lae'l? Okay. Thank you, Lae'l. And in general, just as a FYI, Arizona State University is a partner with Project Stand regarding the work that they're doing regarding student activism. It's been a delight of mine, and I'm sure Shannon could probably speak a little bit about this as well with her work on this, to be a part of this initiative. I talk about it a lot with a lot of folks when it especially comes to activism on institutional campuses, because what Lae'l and Project Stand are doing is quite important when it comes to, again, understanding and documenting student activism, and even now and in the past and in the future. And the more that we try to understand the wide breadth of everything that is going on in our communities, I think projects like Project Stand are going to be critical in making sure that we have that ability to see activism at different stages and what that does for not just institutions, but students, communities, and everybody who's involved with that. Again, thank you, Lae'l. It's been an honor and a privilege to have you here in general. And I want to thank Lae'l for her powerful words. We are going to stop the Zoom recording